Okay, I'm going to get started. Hello and welcome everyone to Infrastructure's last group conversation for 2018. Today I'm going to talk about focus and strategy for the group, what we've done over the last quarter and what we're thinking about next quarter. I'm going to talk about the growth of the team, which has been fantastic. And then we've also welcomed a team into the infrastructure umbrella. I will also talk about blueprints and designs, essentially specific items that we've been thinking and working on. And then I will talk about Q4 OKRs. It's actually, oh, come on. So focus and strategy. Over the last 2 quarters, I've been talking about essentially a relentless focus on GitLab.com observable availability. We have improved significantly. The team has worked really hard, and I think that's shown. Unfortunately, I don't have a graph to share at this time about our availability, but I will make sure to have that ready for the next group conversation. I've been speaking about predictability as how we attain availability. And we've now sort of settled on 2 very specific objectives for infrastructure, essentially to reduce mean time to recovery to be less than 60 seconds. So we want to build infrastructure that essentially you wouldn't notice that we've had an issue, and also to increase mean time between failures to infinity. So there's a ton of work we have to do in terms of fortifying the infrastructure and making sure that the change that we're making can be as transparent as possible and not noticeable to the outside world. So not shabby goals, they're definitely out there, but I think they're achievable. And the team has been thinking about how we can do these things. Growing the infrastructure team, we've welcomed new folks this quarter to the team, 4 technical hires, Peter Dam, Henry Phillips, Hendrik Myers, and June Guo, 3 SREs and 1 DBRE. We're super excited to have them on board, and they've started to have an impact already in the team and the infrastructure. Also in January, we will welcome a 3rd SRE manager to the department. He's based out of Chicago and has extensive experience in automation and operations. Finally, the delivery team has moved to infrastructure. Marion is leading this team. And then there are 4 people in the team, 2 SREs, Alex and John, and then 2 developers, Jorik and Robert. If you remember, I created this blueprint that talked about how we would implement CI/CD and dogfood it for ourselves. And this team is actually tasked with, let me share that in a minute.
Yeah, sorry, Jerry. The slides are not linked, so no one can read ahead or judge what it is.
Sorry. Yeah, let me just get that in there real quick. Chat. Where's chat? I think that's the link that shows up in my browser.
Yep, that works. Thanks.
Excellent. Sorry about that.
No problem.
So as I mentioned, the delivery team is now a part of infrastructure, and they're working to make CI/CD a reality. We want CI/CD not just to dogfood and showcase that we have an excellent CI/CD product, but also because this is the way in which we can finally control how change enters the environment. And also, if these changes are actually small changes that happen over time, then whenever an issue arises, we know exactly what changed in the recent past and what caused this. So our recovery time should be much faster. The team is also chartered with making sure that as we shift to CI/CD, we still continue to be able to distribute on the 22nd of the month. So it's not just moving to CI/CD and be done with it for GitLab.com. This actually affects the entire product. So as we move into the next quarter, this is what the team will look like. We will have 3 site reliability engineering teams led by 3 different managers. They're all working off the same queue. So we are the infrastructure team. And then delivery is sort of cutting across, because delivery is actually handling the thing that actually causes the most number of changes in the environment, which are releases. So more details in the next group conversation as the team, we figure out some of the specifics in terms of hiring and some of the, how do we scale this from the current workflows that we have today, and how do we run a much larger team into next year? Blueprints and designs. We've published a number of important blueprints that are actually driving how we operate. I think one of the most important ones is deltas, which actually addresses how GitLab.com may from time to time branch from the main product, and how the process that we follow to merge that back. A good example of that is the recent upgrade in Postgres land from Red Manager, which has cost us a very large number of problems. I'll address that in a minute, Sid. A large number of problems with the database in cases of failover. And we've replaced that with Petroni. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So that's running on GitLab.com, and we are committed to essentially merging that back into the product. In terms of OKRs, we are getting more aggressive in using OKRs to drive the team and to essentially align with the rest of engineering and the company. And we're putting some tooling around it. As the team has grown, I have found it harder and harder to stay in the details of the.
Sorry, I early submitted something. Just keep going.
No worries. How we plan to use OKRs to ensure that we're aligned with engineering and we know the things that we need to do. This also helps me internally to essentially keep track of progress and alignment within the team, which as large as it is now and as large as it's going to become, is a key challenge at this level. We also published a blueprint on our planning workflow, which essentially describes how we operate in terms of milestones and timings. This is tightly coupled with the OKRs. I'll talk about a few specifics on OKRs in a little bit, and then I'll explain how these two things are related. And then finally, there is a very important OKR that describes service levels and error budgets and how these two are connected. So we've been hearing more and more that we need to provide a strict SLA around GitLab.com and the services we provide. And also we need to take into account error budgets so that we can essentially manage change. The first implementation of error budgets was based on a point system. The new implementation is based on essentially minutes, because what we're measuring is uptime. So it made sense to move to minutes. But in order to measure that, we need to have a good definition of how we actually measure uptime. If you're just pointing to GitLab.com and you always get a 200, maybe discussions don't work, or maybe there's some other issues. So we are working on creating a much stricter definition, sharing it with everyone, and ensuring that we all understand what uptime means. And we're also creating the machinery that is necessary to keep track of this. So this involves the creation of SLIs, SLOs, and ultimately SLAs that we can share with our customers as a strong commitment for our availability. Q4 OKRs. Yes, you're right, Sid. I didn't upgrade that. I didn't update that. That is from the Q3 where we were using the point system. I actually don't have a good, I don't have the error budget for infrastructure calculated for this group conversation. But we will actually publish that by the end of the quarter. We are moving to, sorry, go ahead.
The people watching on YouTube do not have access to the Zoom chat. So want to make sure that we kind of read out the question, or at least tell what it's about.
Okay.
I'll verbalize a bit, and maybe let's go straight to my proposal. Instead of preserving 100% of the error budget, which is kind of confusing because you have a budget you can spend, and then you want to aim for 70% of at least 70% of that, because that's what we do with OKRs. 70% of 100% gets super confusing. So let's do it in points. Or the proposal is actually do it in percentage or number of requests. Maybe not the percentage, because that's getting us into trouble. But our error budgets now kind of treat an outage on Wednesday peak time the same as a one on Sunday, when the usage is much lower, and they don't differentiate between an incremental rollout and a full rollout. They don't differentiate between web and API.
Currently, they don't. And that is part of the reason why we moved away from this point system, because the point system essentially said, if you cost on S1, then this is how many points it consumes for your budget. And so goes on S2 and S3 or S4. Now, on S1, incident that lasts 5 minutes is not the same thing as an S1 incident that lasts 4 hours. So at the end of the day, our goal is to maintain 99.95% availability. And so that actually translates to about, depending on which time frame we use, 20 minutes of downtime per month. So measuring error budgets as minutes seems like the more homogeneous way of doing this. So essentially,
go ahead.
So essentially, if we're counting in terms of minutes, then all the units are aligned. The objective units are aligned, and it's not about percentages. It's about how many minutes we're supposed to maintain this level of service.
I have an alternative proposal. I think minutes are way better than percentages. Percentages are the hardest because now you cannot do percentages to measure where you are. So I love minutes a lot more, but minutes are not equal. Like, how do you deal with like a minute on Saturday is not the same as a minute on Wednesday? And the API might be down, but the web might be up. That's not as bad.
Right, but that's where the definition of SLOs comes into place. So uptime is not the same thing unless we clearly specify what that means. And you're right in that regard.
I might have read just enough of the SRE book to be dangerous, but not enough to be knowledgeable. But we know approximately through the quarter how GitLab.com is going to do, what kind of growth we can expect, and how many requests we're going to handle throughout the quarter. What if we take that number and then go to for the 0.05% that we can fill and say we have a budget of like 1 million, or maybe it's 5 million, or it's going to be a number of that many filled requests. And that way we incentivize incremental rollouts because you're going to spend like 100 or 10 times less if the incremental rollout fails than if a full-blown failure occurs. And you don't have to do kind of this mental gymnastics of, well, it was a minute, but it was not really busy and it was only 1% of the traffic. It's like this many requests, and it's kind of a hard number.
So the SLOs were specifying, take into account not just number of requests, but also latency and some other areas. So we don't consider the ability to say pull, push, and commit the same thing as the ability to have a discussion. So what we're trying to do with the minutes approach is to say we measure in minutes at a certain percentage, but the thing that we can do is, depending on the failure mode, depending on the time of day, depending on the amount of traffic, depending on which component is failing, we can use scalars. So we can use multipliers to say a minute on Saturday is not the same as a minute on Wednesday. And so at the end of the day, what I want to be able to do is to flatten out and count minutes. So a minute on Saturday, maybe it's low traffic, so it's 40% of a minute on Wednesday at peak time. But at the end of the day, it gives us a measure in minutes, regardless of, it takes away all the details. So those calculations and the points you're bringing up are spot on. Right now, this is sort of the first iteration, and it's kind of like a machete. We're just saying we're going to make this path, and then we need to start refining how we do this. But we do this at the SLO level, not at the definition of what uptime is or at the definition of what the error budget is. We can tinker with that at will. Maybe 2 years from now, because we have active, then we decide to count differently, or we decide, look, anything below 60% of being available is total downtime. So we'll tinker with those formulas. But the result should be a number of minutes that I can easily compare to the uptime requirements that the business has given us to maintain availability. So
cool, thanks.
In the service levels blueprint, there is the first cut at how we thought about this problem. I think it's worth taking a second iteration, which is something that we're planning to do for Q1, in refining that. We also are looking at how Andrew's generalized metrics plug into this framework to be able to give us essentially calculate this on the go. Like, I don't want to be doing accounting constantly. But yes, you're right. All these details need to be taken into account. We're just sort of placing them at the SLO layer versus at the uptime number or the error budget number. Anyway, I will continue to move on to the OKR. So another area we focused on is to improve infrastructure's handbook. We did some rearranging of the structure of the handbook, and there has been A number of updates, including the stable counterpart. We still need to do that on the team page. I haven't forgotten about that. As I mentioned, every team has had their own objectives and KRs. So overall, the quarter is going pretty well. We're probably a little bit further behind that we'd like to on DR. But we're actually confident that we're going to hit 70% on most of these by the time the quarter is up. So the future, I spoke about OKRs and how we're sort of revamping how infrastructure is using OKRs. This has been sort of a forcing function for me because as the team has grown, it's just been harder and harder to stay connected to the details. And so OKRs, because we use them at the company and I think they're a very useful tool, is what we're implementing. Every team in infrastructure has their own objective. For instance, for availability, that was to reduce the mean time to recovery. And then every team has 3 KRs. Now, what we're doing to structure this is every KR has a theme for every team. So one of the themes is availability, to make sure that we continue investing on making the site rock solid. Another one is on product. We do have to grow the product. And there are feature requests that are coming to infrastructure, like the macOS share runners, that we need to make sure that we devote cycles to. And it's essentially the channel through which product can actually insert objectives into the infrastructure org. And then the final one is infrastructure, which is a very generic name. I had it as optimization and just general names because I haven't really come up with the right one. But essentially, we do want to carve some time to make sure that we have some cycles to pay off our technical debt, and that we also devote time to workflow optimization. So, we have to iterate. Error budgets is a great example. We do iterations on these workflows and how we operate. So we want to make sure that we set aside time to be able to devote cycles to this. There's a comment from Kathy. You mentioned getting to 99.95% availability uptime. What is your current planned timeframe to achieving that metric? I wish I had a very strict answer. We do want to implement the first set of SLOs at the end of this quarter. So we will be able to calculate that metric and see exactly where we are. There's been several numbers floating around, and depending on who you ask, we've actually exceeded that, but I know that's not the case yet. But certainly before mid-year is where we should have most of the critical components fortified and lots of the workflows that we're using today to make sure that availability is as high as we can make it. Andrew posted a link to a dashboard.
Sorry, I actually sent that a bit soon. Sorry about that.
Okay, no worries. I'm getting used to this too soon link. Anyway, let me just run through this and then we can talk about that. So some wins so far. I am stoked about how the team has been delivering on some of the projects and objectives that we set at the beginning of the quarter. To me, the biggest one, the database has always been this hot spot. It definitely was back in June. We've made a lot of improvements. Well, one of the lessons that we learned after the GCP migration was that Rep Manager was not trustworthy. Almost every case where the database was flaky in terms of failover was due to Rep Manager. And essentially after GCP, we just decided that we needed to go find another solution. So this new solution uses a software called Patroni. It went in production last Saturday. We've been working on it all quarter. And it's very promising. It's widely used in the industry. It actually leverages some of the infrastructure we already had in place, like Console. So far, we're really happy with it. As I mentioned, this is what we consider a delta, which means that we've deviated from product, and we will work probably on Q2 to get this folded back into the product. The reason why we're waiting until Q2 is because I want to make sure during Q1 that we're actually highly confident on the tool and that we've gotten a lot of operational experience with it to be able to ship it to customers. Also, in terms of database backups, restores, and validation, this was a huge issue a few months ago. So we've diligently worked in this. We know when database backups don't work. We actually try restores on a very regular basis in an automated fashion, and then we validate those. So we always know when was the last known good backup that was taken from the database. Let me stop real quick to Mike Walsh is asking, how many people do you expect to be on your team this time next year? I actually don't know yet. We haven't finalized numbers. So I'm not going to make a wild guess until we have an actual number, but there's definitely going to be growth. Then Kathy follows up with, are you able to discuss some of the highlights of what the release delivery team will be doing to ensure that there are less regressions of security hot patches in the near future? Yes, I will talk about that in a minute. In terms of workflows, we've clamped down on the workflow management. So we have a much more fluid method to essentially distribute work to the team and make sure that the milestones are actually met. And then we've done some updates to change and incident management. We've streamlined some areas. We've also gotten a little bit more detail about criticality. So depending on which component of the infrastructure we are operating on, that may determine the criticality. And this also affects, how much change management per se is needed. The end goal of all of this is to essentially do away with these two processes. But right now we use them as essentially guardrails to make sure that changes are widely known and that, whenever we need to take downtime, we communicate that properly. And then the last thing I want to talk about is generalized metrics. We are using this today. If you're monitoring infrastructure, there are these very specific checks that you have against components. It could be, latency on the database or on disk or number of requests. But there are a lot of unknowns. So as we move into service levels and focused on SLIs and SLOs, what we're really using as a guide to let us know when there is an issue are these generalized metrics, which essentially for every service that we've identified in the infrastructure, we essentially keep track of what the stable parameters are over the course of a week. And then we essentially observe those. When we go off, say, 1 or 2 standard deviations from the same period, say, a week ago, then we start getting alerts. If we don't have a specific alert for a component that is causing trouble, then this actually uncovers unknown unknowns. The system, which Andrew wrote, has caught every incident we've had, where at times we've realized that we didn't have specific monitoring for a specific aspect of the infrastructure. So this is sort of an early warning system, and it also serves to let us know where the holes for specific monitoring are. So this has been a huge help, and this actually will underpin the error budget implementation. So all these definitions for SLOs will go into the system, and we will essentially keep track of error budgets and availability automatically. So let me address Kathy's last question. I'll repeat it. Are you able to discuss some of the highlights of what the release delivery team will be doing to ensure that there are less regressions of security hot patches in the near future? So I think the answer to that question is that is tightly coupled to our ability to move to CI/CD, where smaller changes can actually be isolated, and where we can have CI/CD pipelines that actually attempt to essentially focus on every change. So I think that by itself is going to be huge, because today, whenever we do an RC release, that's hundreds of changes that are going into the environment. So being able to test for all of it, and once an issue is discovered, being able to find it, it should be, our mean time to recover to finding this issue should be way faster with CI/CD. In terms of hot patches, what happens today is whenever we hot patch, we don't do any RC. We just go into the environment and hot patch. But as we move to CI/CD, then hot patches just become just another change that goes into this pipeline of small changes that we're doing. So we should be able to streamline very significantly a response time to security incidents. Also, with a few ones that we've had recently, we've learned some of the workflows. So I think our response has actually improved and is much smoother than it's been in the past. And we will continue to learn on that. If there are any specific things you'd like to see the delivery team focus on as it relates to security, do let us know. Let's sit down and let's figure out, if there are any angles that we need to to focus on for security.
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. I just want to also highlight other issues that could probably use more automation work as well. Like, for example, if we have a critical security release that's going at the same time as a release candidate, right? Where someone forgets to do something like cherry pick the security fix out of the general. So then we have a problem with exposure. So we want to try to minimize or reduce that in the future as well. So let's chat about that too.
Yeah, I mean, that's been one of the biggest headaches because whenever there is a security release or a hot patch, it has a huge impact on the system. And by the system, I don't mean the infrastructure. I mean us, the humans, as a system to get this thing in production and patched. So as we move to CI/CD, then these smaller changes that address these very specific issues, our response time, I think it can be way, way quicker. And we would never forget to reapply a hot patch, right? To cherry pick and sort of say, okay, here's an EORC. Oh, by the way, you need to reapply this thing. So this use case that you're talking about is something that I think CI/CD will help us address, because there will no longer be this RCs being dropped in production as blocks. But the general idea is that moving forward, what we release on the 22nd is the collection of all these changes at a given point in time. And the thing about it is we no longer have to do all this testing because these changes have been running in production over time for a significant amount of time. So we're still looking at producing the general releases. It's just how we essentially build them. It's going to happen in a slightly different order. And by doing this small amount of serial changes, then all these things are running in production for days, as opposed to what we're doing today, which is we do an RC, and then we watch the platform very carefully. It's just too much change for the system to absorb. And as we grow and the number of changes increases because we add more functionality or we fix more things, we need to build a CI/CD system that can actually absorb this much amount of change. But it's still always, this stream of changes that is going into the environment. So, question from Hendrik: when every code change is applied in a CI/CD fashion, who would release this work in terms of versioning? How would release this work in terms of versioning? I don't have a specific answer for that. That's actually something that Marin and his team need to answer. So I don't have a good answer, but I will pass it along to Marin for them to let us know how they plan on doing that. Great. Thanks. You're welcome. Well, thank you, everybody. We're almost done with 2018, and I'm super excited. It's been a great year, and I think 2019 is going to be even better. So thank you all. Have a good one.